Okay, here we are, 2026. Happy New Year. We're back with another poem. We're going to read today one called Semiotics by Megan Fernandez. She's a new poet to me. Um, she's been at it for, a little while. She's young to me, but she teaches at a university in New York. She's based in New York. And this poem is one that I don't have it in print. I found it on poetry.org, and I'm going to drop a link here in the below here to the text at poetry.org if you'd like to read it. Um, so, without any more ado, I think I'll just read the poem. Semiotics. I went to the Rockaways to look for dolphins, saw three, and assigned each of them a meaning. I called it a sign. This is what I do: find a noun, usually an animal, and give it an intervention in my life. And if there is sudden rain, even better. I don't believe in coincidences. When the sea and the sky talk in tandem, that's fate. Last year, instead of going to rehab, my friend booked a trip to the Maldives and asked me to join him. He put the whole thing on his credit card and did it the minute we got home from Presbyterian on 75th, while an orange ID bracelet still spun on his wrist like the Wonder Wheel. What should I say to him? That I admire his audacity to be ill? That he knows to be ill is natural given the state of the world? And how is everyone not ill, overdosing on the night? Because the nukes are coming. Our optimism is not enough to make it not so. Our optimism is all we have. Well, that and beauty. He always says to me, Megan, beauty doesn't need a metaphor. He asks if I will stop him. I shrug. Only he knows what can save us. And, anyways, the interventions I believe in are not earthly. I mean, he's got Coney Island on his wrist. One must look for signs to believe in them. Okay, so we have a big pile of short couplets here, 27 in all, and in free verse, there's no rhyming. It has the flow and rhythms of everyday speech, I'd say. There's nothing about the language that's so ornate or so syntactically surprising or disjunctive that it would slow your momentum through it, I don't think. So reads pretty smoothly. Indeed, if someone read this aloud to you cold, without your having the text in front of you in print, you might well think that you were hearing a passage of prose, and that's not a dig by any means. It's a narrative poem. It has a protagonist. There is some species of a sequence of events here. One of them, or one set of them, is her memory of an exchange that she had with a friend the the prior year, the year prior to the, so to speak, present action of the poem. I think its language is notable in one respect for how declarative and assertive it is, both in substance and in intonation. I think that plays out in its accentual character or rhythm. The stresses hit hard. Um, I haven't gone through and assigned, decided what poetic feat are happening, at every moment. But I would say you probably would find a preponderance of trochees and spondies. Um, the trochee being a two-syllable poetic foot again, where the first syllable is stressed, and a spondee is where a two-syllable poetic foot where both are stressed. There are a lot of emphatic stresses in the poem, and it gives it this assertive character. And then in substance, that it that aligns very well with its substance. It seems to me that the poem doesn't seem to be wondering about anything, or speculating, or agonizing, or struggling to, or asking questions. Really, questions do occur here, but they seem less to me interrogative than, again, in the service of declaration or assertion. Rhetorical questions, or questions set the stage for an immediate assertion, um, that sounds definitive, decided, and definitive, and kind of final. At the same time, though it has the conversational rhythm, I would say, of everyday speech. This is not, of course, the stuff of everyday speech. Parts of it, anyway, aren't immediately transparent, as we'll see. These aren't the kinds of remarks people make to each other in normal conversation. Right off the top, we find our protagonist, uh, and I'm going to call the protagonist she. That's the pronoun I'll use because it seems to be at one point she's referred to as Megan, which is the name of the poet, also. So, however autobiographical this is, I'm considering the protagonist, whose name is Megan, to be a separate created being and not the poet, the person, Megan Fernandez. Exactly. So, anyway, right off the top, we see her doing something that's, I think most people would find unusual or puzzling. She's gone to the seashore, she's looking for dolphins, um, and, and she's assigning them, she says, a meaning. So, what does that mean? Why is she doing this? What is meant by assigning a separate meaning to each of the three dolphins that she sees? Um, So let me give a sort of a narrative summary of the poem, and we'll come back to those first lines. So again, she goes to the shore. She sees these dolphins. She assigns them a meaning. She kind of reflects, introspects on what she's doing, which seems to be creating meaning through the linguistic and symbolic appropriation of sensory experience or the phenomenal world or what have you. Then in the second part of the poem, she tells us about a friend, who, instead of going to rehab, um, presumably for a substance addiction, decides to book a trip to the Maldives, invites her to join him, puts it all on a credit card the minute they get home from the hospital. She seems to debate with herself slightly about how to respond to this. She wonders if she should commend him for accepting illness as this immutable, incurable, so to speak, condition of human life. Um, but again, she's doing that. And she's asking questions, but these don't seem like true self-interrogating questions. Where she's exploring, they seem like rhetorical questions to me. Of course, she's not going to say those things to him. She seems to be saying she doesn't believe. She seems not to believe that we should surrender to this sense of ourselves as constitutively ill or broken and awaiting dissolution, however true an account of our situation that may be. Um, we have to assert our optimism and our need for or reverence for beauty against it, however inadequate to the task that proves to be ultimately. Um, we're not really up to this. The nukes are coming, as she says. Uh, our optimism isn't going to stop them from coming, but we must nonetheless cast forth our optimism against these forces of decay and dissipation and destruction, because it's all we have. Um, and so perhaps she's making an assertion of our creative freedom, um, to make our own meaning, and therefore, an assertion and a celebration in a way of our humanity. Um, so, okay, I've wandered a little bit from the a bare recitation of the narrative here, but that's all right. Um, so she decides not to. She just forbears to judge or even give advice to him when he asks her, first, if she'll go with him on the trip, and then will he stop her. Um, I mean, and this made me wonder whether she just doesn't want to deny her friend that essential human agency by herself intervening to pressure him into, a socially kind of determined course of action, uh, that seeking treatment for a substance addiction. This is where the poem, I think, gets a little uncomfortable, and we'll get to that in a second. But I think first, to get a handle on what's going on here, I think we need to say a word about this intellectual discipline that gives the poem its title, semiotics. Okay, so semiotics is the study of what in linguistics are called signs. Excuse me. It's an academic discipline, an intellectual discipline that arises from Saussurean linguistics. It was Saussure. I don't know that he was the first one to call words, for example, or verbal concepts signs. Um, but he was it was he who elaborated that into a certain kind of structure. Each word, let's just take a word as an example. A sign can be a word, it can be an image, it can be a sound. Conceivably, it can be any human pro, uh, projection of meaning, and so any idea, anything like that. And he to take a word, he broke it down into. I'm sorry, excuse me. Into signifier, signified, and then sign. So a signifier is simply um, the um, the the sequence of letters that make a word. For example, the letters CHAR, chair. Um, the signifier is that alone, seen by itself. The thing you sit in um, is the signified. So whether in context that's a specific chair or whether it's just chair in the abstract, the idea of a chair, either way, that's the signified. And when the two of them are brought together, that is a sign. Um, yeah, and a sign can be anything that can be given meaning. But we're talking here about a word. So the idea here is that language, in terms of its ability to signify, to mean things, um, is, and then this has been elaborated by other thinkers who were influenced by Saussure, like Derrida, like Lacan, any number of others. Claude Lévi-Strauss. I mean, the Saussurian linguistics was very influential in all kinds of intellectual theoretical disciplines following Saussure. But the way that it tends to work is that language is a kind of like a Ponzi scheme. That the meaning of each word or sign isn't present in it. That meaning is supplied, that is, by other words and signs, which in turn get their meaning from other words and on and on and on. So, what is a chair? Well, you need to, if you want to define a chair, you have to use other words to define that chair. And all the words you used to define the chair, each one of those has to use other words to define it, and on and on and on. Um, so each word is in a way, um, again back to the Ponzi metaphor, is borrowing from other signs and kind of spending capital it doesn't have. Um, and so are all those other signs behind it, going on and around, on and on forever. Though, as a practical matter, the context for all of this signifying is usually we're talking within one or another belief or value system, often an ideology. And what holds together and grounds an ideology is what Lacan, for example, and I think others, Lacan, whose thought again is deeply dependent on Saussure's scheme, calls a master signifier, the one ultimately to which all the other signifiers refer. And that signifier is really just another signifier, but we give it special status to create the appearance of stability and coherence in this system of values or of thought, this political ideology, this, whatever it may be. It's really, of course, to some extent, this is a fiction because true reality, I think most people would agree, does exceed our limited capacities, and we're just not able to develop conceptual structures that, the more and more people, we learn about the world and people and the universe and so on, it exceeds our capacities to organize it into a coherent whole. There's just too much we don't know. So the master signifier is imposed, in other words, upon reality and charged with this orienting, organizing, balancing um, efficacy. Um, so I'm remembering in Don DeLillo's novel, um, Underworld, which appeared about 30 years ago. There's just a passing reference, and I think DeLillo is very conversant with all of these theoretical, movements and this way of thinking about language. I think that's really evident from reading his fiction. He says at one point, I forget the exact context, but you're with a character. They're in their kitchen, and he mentions that we have a paper bag for the paper bags. Um, and I think that's a nice little trope for this dynamic I'm talking about, the master signifier in relation to all the other signifiers that it organizes and gives a consistency to. So because seeing the paper bags inside of a paper bag is seeing the human intention imposed upon these objects. They're not just laying around, they're there, they're being saved, they're being held for a purpose, for use. So you see them organized in this way for this human purpose or end, and it's the bag that contains the others that in a way creates that field of human intention. It that bag is in the role of the master signifier in this little organized universe, even though there's nothing special about that particular bag, nothing intrinsic about it that makes it especially suitable to be the bag that contains the other bags. Um, Literally any, in principle anyway, literally any of the others could have done it. I mean, let's assume a bag of bags where they're all the same size. It's not like there's one that it's completely arbitrary, and that's the way, ultimately the way the master signifier, that's its relation to the signifiers that it's it's dominating and organizing. So okay, that's I think that's the kind of dynamic that she's talking about. She gave her poem this title, Semiotics, and I think that authorizes all these kinds of this kind of discussion about it. So let's go back and look at those first lines. I'll just read them again. I went to the Rockaways to look for dolphins, saw three, and assigned each of them a meaning. I called it a sign. This is what I do: find a noun, usually an animal, and give it an intervention in my life. Okay. Um, but actually, she goes on to say, and if there's sudden rain, even better. I don't believe in coincidences. When the sea and the sky talk in tandem, that's fate. What we see her doing is creating, and you might say imposing, meaning on the reality outside of herself. So you have this same kind of dynamic. You see her role in the creation of that meaning, um, and creation of meaning understood in contradistinction to the discovery of meaning or the uncovering of a meaning that's already there independent of her consciousness. um, so she's saying, this is what I do: find a noun, usually an animal, give it an intervention in my life. um, yeah. Yes. um, so the intervening agent here, the noun that's usually an animal, the thing that is intervening upon her consciousness, is not the initiator of this process. I think that's the key thing here. Um, we would normally expect it to be that way if something as something intrudes upon whoever or whatever is its object. On the contrary, it's she, the protagonist, who is the consciousness being intervened upon, that is that initiator. So she's both active and passive. She's acting and acted upon. um, the intervention it is making into her consciousness and the fabric of her experience is catalyzed by her. And yet, it seems it's not any the less real or authentic or valuable for that. Um, so the poem seems to be insisting on this Hall of Mirrors process, the primary initiating role of the perceiving consciousness in the generation of meaning that is then experienced as an orienting force outside of oneself. But it's still authentically meaningful, despite in some degree that the creating the consciousness is not discovering something outside of itself, but is projecting it. Um, this doesn't seem to be any kind of, as it might be for someone else, the description of this dynamic doesn't seem to be any kind of a problem from the point of view of the poem, or a crisis of meaning or anything like that. There's an almost chipper, I would say, acceptance of that condition. So it's overtly and confidently assigning language to experience, hanging signifiers on the perceived or experienced phenomena in a way that doesn't just, as I say, doesn't just show an untroubled acceptance of the human need to do that, but seems to celebrate it, um, um, to assert it as necessary, um, in the teeth of the, I think, implicitly acknowledged hocus pocus of instability of it all. She's making sign making is a defiant creative act. Um, I think it's fair to say. Um, so this intellectual discipline of semiotics is anything here but the special preserve of academic specialists. It's here seen as the cardinal condition of everyday life. Um, and in fairness, though, that's how a semiotician in the academy would see it too. That this is everybody participates in this. As opposed to other kinds of um, academic specialties. I mean, not everybody reads Russian literature of the 19th century, but everybody participates in sign making um, and in this whole process that of using language to order, create order or a sense of order where it doesn't necessarily exist. Um, at least not in the proportions and contours of that we decide it does. um, so then the poem moves to this encounter with the friend, and what are we to make of that? Uh, where she begins to relate that encounter marks the point in the poem where the protagonist steps outside of herself. We've seen her in isolation in the first lines, describing this solitary activity at the seashore, but now she's entered a social context, interacting with another person. In a way, you could say she's still isolated because she's relating a memory from the prior year. So, from the point of view of the present action of the play, she's still a solitary figure, but we are nonetheless presented with an exchange that she has had with this other person. So the friend has evidently been just released from a hospital. He gets home and books a trip to the Maldives instead of going to the presumably doctor recommended rehab. um, and he seems to seek validation from her about his chosen course of action, maybe judgment. He asks her to go with him, asks her if she'll stop him from going to the Maldives. She doesn't answer the question about going with him, um, and she seems very disinclined to try to stop him via an intervention, which seems to be what is meant here. And he calls it an she mentions an intervention in this context, and it's the second occurrence of that word. And remember, in the first lines, she had spoken of making signs and giving them an intervention in her life. Here she says the only interventions she believes in are not earthly. So perhaps this mention of an addiction intervention is meant to contrast with and further illuminate the intervention described in the process of sign making that we saw at the beginning of the poem. And that one seems to be what she means by not earthly. So I don't want to say it's that categorically. I just want to note that the suggestiveness of the poem's juxtaposition of these two senses of the word intervention, um, the one involving her use of language to give shape and order and direction to her experience, and the other, the very earthly intervention of the sort that people do to get substance abusing loved ones into treatment. Um, some curious tropes in this part of the poem. For example, the orange hospital wristband he's wearing. Um, she says in one place it's spun on his wrist like the Wonder Wheel, which is that's a ride at Coney Island. I had to look that up. I've never been to Coney Island. In another place, again referring to the wristband, she says he's got Coney Island on his wrist. The color of the wristband is she notes that it's orange, and and I assume that means hospitals will color code wristbands for patients of different categories, different statuses. So I assume that the orange is a signifier, if I may, for the hospital staff that of his addiction or his high risk status or whatever it might be. Um, but it's given a very different valence by these tropes associating it with carefree amusement, with Coney Island. Um, that's curious. And the structure of this moment in the poem, that line, I mean, he's got Coney Island on his wrist, follows and seems opposite to the line, the interventions I believe in are not earthly. In other words, it seems to emerge as a substantiation or warrant for her valuing only non-earthly interventions. In other words, this is why I believe only in non-earthly interventions. He's got Coney Island on his wrist. Um, and perhaps that's an assertion of the power and the of the imagination and its power to transform. That this surreal image conjured by Coney Island on his wrist um, testifies to the power of human signification, the power of our ability to imaginatively reorder the world with tropes and concepts and make our way that way. Um, that we're not helplessly adrift in an unresponsive reality, that our creative faculty can transform it, and that creative faculty is itself part of reality. Um, you know that this seems to this seems to authorize that idea. The possibility of that idea is operating here, and I think that's interesting. If something like this is the suggestion, then we can see a thematic continuity with the first lines. But here, in contrast with to her standing at the seashore alone, assigning meaning to dolphins, meanings to separate dolphins, and she's in isolation from others, abstracted from the dynamics of relationships with other people, the pleasures and satisfactions and comforts of those interactions, as well as their duties and hazards. Um, Now we see this faculty operating in a more immediately consequential lived context, a social context, and therefore a moral context, morality being concerned most essentially with how people treat each other. And I think this is slightly more uncomfortable for that reason. What do we make of her seeming to stand at arm's length from her friend's situation? Should she urge him into rehab, whether or not she actually stages an intervention? Um, or would she feel that she's imposing on his integrity and autonomy as an individual seeker of what is meaningful and valuable to him? Would she see herself as unjustifiably stepping between him and his, so to speak, inalienable right to assert his own meanings and valuations of his reality? And I'll leave those as questions, but I do think one essential thing happening here um, is that the poem asks you to think of what the poem asks you to think about, I think, is your nature, for want of a better way of putting it, as a moment by moment semiotician. um, what it looks like when you consider a person in isolation, and then when they're actors in the lives of others, which is to say, from a moral point of view, again, something we do um, because we must, and both ourselves individually and collectively we do it in all sorts of ways. I mentioned ideologies and all kinds of belief systems. That's what will be happening from the point of view of this view of looking at language, this way of looking at language, and of looking at what looking at epistemology too, how we know things we know, what we know, how we know things we know, etc. Um, so maybe the idea here is to make us think about this mysterious intimacy between consciousness and language and the human role in the production of meaning. Um, and I wonder if she's inclined to see this as, in some way, this process as in some way spiritual, as opening us up to some intimation of what that which abides behind the veil of appearances, the ground of all things, all that is. Um, and is that ground really us in our value creating agency? Are we the meaning we've been waiting for? um, so in the end, I think the poem gives you um, this this confident and in some ways defiant and unapologetic assertion of the self-sufficiency of the human production of meaning as requiring no warrant beyond itself, um, and sets this against a vision of what that project, so to speak, is erected against: loss and sickness and suffering and mortality, I guess, at the end. But I think in the middle part, I find it ambiguous and a little uncomfortable, how when that's imported into that thing we all do is imported into a social context with a person you have a relationship with and in some sense responsibilities toward. how that works itself out, at least in the way it's the account of that that's given here. So I don't want to, impose a thesis on this poem. I just want to tease out some what I think are some of the ideas and some of the questions that it raises. I think it's an interesting poem, Megan Fernandez, and so I will wrap it up here by reading it again. Semiotics. I went to the Rockaways to look for dolphins, saw three, and assigned each of them a meaning. I called it a sign. This is what I do: find a noun, usually an animal, and give it an intervention in my life. And if there is sudden rain, even better. I don't believe in coincidences when the sea and the sky talk in tandem. That's fate. Last year, instead of going to rehab, my friend booked a trip to the Maldives and asked me to join him. He put the whole thing on his credit card and did it the minute we got home from Presbyterian on 75th, while an orange ID bracelet still spun on his wrist like the Wonder Wheel. What should I say to him? That I admire his audacity to be ill, that he knows to be ill is natural given the state of this world, and how is everyone not ill, overdosing on the night? Because the nukes are coming. Our optimism is not enough to make it not so. Our optimism is all we have. Well, that and beauty. He always says to me, Megan, beauty doesn't need a metaphor. He asks if I will stop him. I shrug. Only he knows what can save us. And anyways, the interventions I believe in are not earthly. I mean, he's got Coney Island on his wrist. One must look for signs to believe in them. Okay, well, thanks. And again, Happy New Year. And till next time.